In this video, we are going to continue building our React version of our quiz game. So we're going to take what I have on the right-hand side here is our HTML, CSS, JavaScript version. So we're going to take this page and start putting it into our play page in our React application. So last few times we learned how to create markup inside of our React application. So we were able to bring over our about page. And we also learned how to use state, which allowed us to create this page that will eventually allow us to configure which questions get loaded and pulled from the Trivia API. But in this video, we're specifically going to be focusing on this page where we're going to fill out, instead of having this text as a placeholder, fill it out with our stats, our question, and our answers. And this process of bringing this over into our React application, we're going to learn a few new things. One, we're going to learn how to break this apart into components and figure out where the state should live in each of those components within our application. Then we're also going to learn how to take an array, like we had our array of answers here, and render that array inside of React. To kick things off, we're going to do a little bit of whiteboard planning to get a sense of what we're trying to do before we actually start coding. So our structure of our application was that we had these pages: about page, new game page, play page. So these were each components, and we were loading them into our app, which is like the root of our application, and that's wrapped in a router, and the router uses this switch to determine which component should be loaded based on the URL. So I'm going to grab a whiteboard and we're going to focus specifically on this play page component. So let me paste in our existing HTML structure. So this is the game running, but I've just trimmed away the header and footer because this is what the contents, this is what our play page component should eventually render. And we've got a couple of pieces. So we've got stats, and then we've got our trivia item. And within that trivia item, we have question, and we have answers. So we could start trying to map out what our JSX might look like for these elements. So I'm going to create a component here for play page and close this tag. Whoops. Play page. And then inside of that, there are a lot of different ways we could break this down, but we're going to go with a structure that looks something like this, where inside of the play page, we will have a quiz game component. Whoops, forgot the slash there. Inside of the quiz game, we're going to need two things. We're going to need a component for the stats, this bit, and then a component for the trivia item, this bit. So these are going to be siblings. They're not going to be nested within each other. So once we've got a sketch of the components and their structure here, we can try and describe what we want each of them to do, and then we can think about what should the state be associated with each of those. So I'm going to slide over a little bit so we can do this. So our quiz game component, this is going to be responsible for figuring out which question to load. So it's going to have an array of all of the questions, and it will pick out one that it will be able to pass down to the trivia item. So it is going to be the kind of workhorse that determines which question to load. And it's also going to be responsible for keeping track of the score. So the stats component is going to be a pretty simple component that we're just going to give it as props, the score and the level and number, the question number, and it will just render those out. So it's not going to have any state or complex logic associated with it. The quiz game is going to hold on to the score and be responsible for keeping track of the score. So workhorse that determines which question to load and tracks score. Stats is going to be a simple component to render score, whoops, not SOAR, score, etc. And then our trivia item is going to be told, here's the question, here are the answers, and it is responsible for sort of displaying that specific trivia item. So display trivia item with shuffled answers. And it's also going to be responsible for making sure that the quiz game knows when one of these things has been clicked. Whoops. So it is going to be responsible for displaying the trivia item with shuffled answers and notifying when right, wrong answer is selected. So with those simple descriptions, we can start to think about where the state should live inside of our component. So the state that we had inside of our HTML version, or HTML, CSS, JavaScript version, we had the score, we had the, the trivia index. So that was in our array of trivia questions. Where are we? Are we at the first? Are we at the last element? And that was pretty much the main pieces of state that we had inside of the application. So when we want to think about where to put them, we want to think about which component makes the most sense. Where in our hierarchy over here should each of those live? Who needs access to those pieces of information? So for instance, if we take our trivia index, it doesn't really make sense for a trivia item component that is just responsible for individual trivia items to know anything about the index. It doesn't make sense to put that inside of trivia item. So we'd want to put that inside of our quiz game. So this will have a piece of state, and it'll be like the trivia item index. And we can get rid of this here. And then when we want to think about where score should live, we might be tempted to put it inside of like our stats component, but the score needs to be updated when the trivia is marked right or wrong. So score also doesn't make sense to put inside of trivia item, but sometimes it makes sense to have that piece of state a level higher. So if we put that state inside of our quiz game, so we have the score stored inside of the quiz game, our stats component will be able to render it. We'll be able to pass it from quiz game into stats. And because our trivia item is going to be responsible for telling the quiz game when a thing has been marked right or wrong, then our quiz game will be able to go ahead and update that score when the time comes. So in terms of state, our stats, not really going to have any state. And our trivia item is going to end up having a piece of state that we'll get into why it needs to be there when we start displaying it, but it's going to have the shuffled answers. So our quiz game is going to kind of look up the appropriate trivia item, pass in all of that information into our trivia item component, and that trivia item component will be responsible for sort of coming up with a random order of the answers over here to display when that question is presented. Okay, that's a high-level preview. It may not make complete sense at the moment, but when we dig into coding, this will start to make more sense. So I'm going to shut down the whiteboard, flip back in here. I'm making sure that my application is set up with the npm run start command so that it's compiled and the dev server is open. And then what I want to do is create placeholders for those components that we just diagrammed out. So I want to create a new component for the quiz game. I want to fill this in with a placeholder. I want to also create that stats component. And the TriviaItem component. And while we're at it, I'm going to go ahead and add a comment in here to make a note of what each of these components should do. So the TriviaItem we said was responsible for displaying individual pieces of trivia with shuffled answers and notifying when the right, wrong answer is selected. So display a piece of trivia and notify when the right, wrong answer is selected. Our stats we said was just going to simply render the score, level, and question number. And our quiz game, this was our workhorse that keeps track of which trivia item should be loaded and keeps track of the score. So we've got these mocks of the components. We have sort of a roadmap of what we're going to do. Let's get them into our page so that we can see them running. So into that play page, instead of just having a div placeholder, I want to place our quiz game component. You can see that as I was typing that, the IntelliSense auto-imported quiz game for me. So if I flip back, I should see quiz game show up in the browser here. So if I go to my quiz game component, what I just did there was with your imports from other files, if you hold Alt and then click on it, it'll take you to that file where that thing that you imported is defined. So I quickly hopped to the quiz game here. So instead of just displaying the text of quiz game, let's get those two components rendering. So stats, let's bring the stats in. And let's bring TriviaItem in and save it. Make sure those are imported at the top. Stats, TriviaItem. We're not going to worry about the styling just yet. We already wrote the CSS and the HTML and markup. Those should be easy to port over to this React structure. What I want to highlight first is this idea of where the state lives and what props we're going to need. So for our stats, if we look back, let me grab my whiteboard again. Our stats are going to have the score, level, and question. So what I want to do is be able to, from our quiz game, pass in like score is 0, level is 1, question num is 1, and then our stats should be able to render those properties. So our quiz game will know the score, the level, and the current question number, and our stats is going to be sometimes referred to as like a dumb component that is just has no logic. It just takes what it's given and renders it. So I can flip over to my stats component. I'm going to hit Alt and click on it to hop in here. we want to create props and then destructure our props into individual variables. Whoops, misspelled that. Const. Let me zoom this editor in slightly. So we're going to have our score, level, and question num from our props. And then our stats component here, we can just print each of those out in a div for now. We'll come back and refactor this and bring in our styling and markup, but this will be fine. So level, question number, question num. So these props need to match exactly, the names that we specify here need to match exactly inside of our quiz game what we pass in here. So as long as we have those matching, we should see 0 print out for the score, 1 for the level, 1 for the question num. And let's restart that. My computer crashed while writing this tutorial, so I gotta start this over. npm run start. So we can see score, level, question number, all printing out. And if we use our developer tools, so I'm going to pop open the developer tools, go to the React components. I can see the tree of everything that has been rendered to the page. And I can click on my quiz game and see where the props and states would be. Right now, props and state would be, we don't have anything in there, but I can look at my stats and I could change any of these. So I could change the level to be 10, our component updates, or I could change the score to be 10 and our score updates. So we're going to use this to check out how the state works in our application as we add the state. So the next thing I want to do is make the quiz game responsible for the state, for the score state, and then use that to drive this property here. This is a quick note. If you haven't watched the debugging video yet that's in this playlist, check that out. We talk about the React Dev tools, but this is a Chrome extension that you have to install to be able to get this components panel and profiler panel or window. So we're going to flip back here and we want to create that state. So score set score equals use state, and we'll set it to 0. And you want to make sure up at the top here that you bring in the named export use state from the React library. So now we can pass in the score, this variable, into our stats component. And if I flip back and look at our quiz game, we can now see that state here for our score. And whenever the state changes, like to 5 for our quiz game, that means our quiz game re-renders and our stats will re-render and get the new prop. So we can also see what it looks like if our quiz game is responsible for that index that keeps track of which trivia item we have loaded. So we'll start at index 0, which would be the first element in the array. We'll bring that array over in a second. And when we want to create that question num, which number we want to use the index +1. Because when we're at the first element, that is an index of 0, but in common parlance, that would be the first question. So we want to pass that in as well. So we can see question number 1, score 0, and then when the quiz game changes from one item to the next, like going from 0 to 1, that state would change in our application, and now our stats component is getting a new prop. So that the quiz game re-rendered and passed in that question num prop as 2. Change it again, And again, it's getting the new prop. Okay, so now that we've got some of the state here, let's go ahead and bring over the styling and markup for our stats component. So we're going to need a stats.css file, and I'm going to make sure that I import that here inside of our stats component. And then I'm going to bring over the HTML project, and I want to go to my index where we had defined that stats container. I am going to copy that, bring that over into React here. I'm going to paste it below the div so that we can work on moving these variables over. I'm going to comment out this. So we've got stats, stat container, stat label. So we'll bring over that CSS in a second. For now, I just want to place these variables in here. So inside of the score div, we want to drop in the score. Inside of the level, we'll put the level. And inside of the question number, we will put that question num. And you know what, now that I'm looking at it, we forgot one prop here. We need to also pass in the number of questions. So we have the current question, which we're on, and then we also need num questions as a prop that we will put in here. So let's get rid of this. And flipping back to the quiz game, let's pass in the num questions and make sure this renders in our unstyled version. So unstyled version, looking fine. Inside of our stats component, we need to remember that class is not something that we can use in JSX. We have to rename that to class name because class is a reserved word in the JavaScript language. So I am just going to go ahead and Control H to do a find and replace. And I'm going to take class and replace it with class name, and then replace all instances in this file. And now we can start bringing over that CSS. So go back to my stats.css file, flip back to my HTML project, and grab the stats.css. And we just need all of this file. And it should just be this file since we had organized things in a modular way. Paste it in, save it, check it out in the browser. There we go. We got our score, our level, our question, 1 of 10. And again, same thing. When the state changes here for the score, now our styled version of the component updates and state changes for which question we're on, the question section of our stats will update. So the stats is done. Like we've essentially finished that component and can move on to working on the trivia item. So for the trivia item, we need to bring some of our data back over. So we need that giant array of the trivia questions. So I want to organize this in a new folder. I'm going to create a data folder where I will put large chunks of data that we're using in our application, like our trivia questions. So I'm going to come back here. I'm going to my trivia items file. I'm just going to copy and paste everything that I've got in here and recreate that inside of this data folder. So this is just a series of those questions that we pulled from the Trivia API. Has category, question, correct answers, an array of incorrect answers. So what I want to do is inside of our quiz game, grab this array so that we have access to it, grab one of these that corresponds to our index, and be able to use the question, correct answer, and incorrect answers. So back in quiz game, I'm going to import that. So I'm going to import the trivia items from, go up into my data folder, down into the trivia items JavaScript file. So now that I have it, I could console.log to print it out so that we can see it inside of our quiz game. Anytime our quiz game renders, we will see that printed out into our console window. Got an array of 10 things, and each one has that data. So we want to grab the element from this array that corresponds to our current index. So I could say current trivia item is equal to trivia items and use the trivia index. And now I could print out that current trivia item to make sure that I've got it. So I can just see one printing out here, and it's that first question about Marley and me. And I want to take this a step further. I want to pull out just the question, the incorrect answers, and the correct answers, because that's all our trivia item needs to be able to render. Remember, we weren't doing anything with the other pieces of data, so we just have the question and the incorrect and correct answers. So I'm going to use destructuring to pull these out, and I can look at my console log to see what the properties are. So I can see the names here. I want correct underscore answer, incorrect underscore answers, and question. Whoops, I already made a typo. Correct answer, incorrect answers, and question. And I can, as I'm going, verify that I did that correctly by just throwing these into a console.log. And I can see I got them. I got Labrador Retriever as the correct answer, those 3 incorrect answers, and the question all printing out. So we just need to go ahead and pass those along to our trivia item as props. So we're going to do the same thing. We got to decide what our prop names should be for our trivia item. So we could do that here. And then we're going to have to go update trivia item to actually define that trivia item uses these props. So I like to use camel case for my prop names. And that allows us to take, our data. The API gave us this prop name. So now I'm switching from their convention to my convention of defining props in camel case. So I can pass in correct answer, incorrect answers, also in camel case, and pass in incorrect answers, and also pass in our question. And when I save this, my formatter prettier is going to take care of putting each of these attributes on a new line, which makes this a little bit more readable since nothing's getting cut off at the end of the screen. So I'm just taking these variables, these local variables with inside of quiz game, and popping them into properties named correct answer, incorrect answer, and question. So what I want to do is go over to trivia item. I'm alt-clicking to hop into there. Define props, and pull out correct answer, incorrect answers, and question from props. So we'll do the same thing we did before. Let's just make sure that this works and prints something to the screen, and then we'll go ahead and bring over our markup and start making it prettier. So I'll put the question, let's put it in a div. Drop in the correct answer, and drop in our array of incorrect answers. And I can get rid of this console.log. So if we did everything correctly, we should see those 3 things printing out on the screen. So what breed of dog, blah, 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 Labrador, and then the 3 incorrect answers all shoved together. And what's cool about the DevTools is that we can, again, test our state and see whether this idea of where the state should live works. So if I go to my quiz game and I change the question num, the trivia index from 0 to 1 and hit enter, we can see our trivia item now re-renders. So the quiz game, its state changed, so it re-rendered and re-renders everything that's a child of it. So our trivia item now re-renders, with the new props that are passed in from our second question. I can do it again. I could go to the sixth question and see that those properties are now updated for the sixth question. So let's bring over some of the styling and markup for our trivia item. So I'm going to do the same thing, TriviaItem.css. Import that in here. Flip back to our project, go our HTML JavaScript project, grab the TriviaItem.css, which should be everything that we need here in terms of styling. Drop that in here. And then we're going to also want our markup for the trivia item, which was in our index as a template. So we had this div as our template. I'm going to delete what we had there before. We're going to do the same process of, I'm going to just select class, Control H, replace class with class name. This works in our file currently because we have no JavaScript classes defined, which is if you don't know what those are, don't worry, but it's a way for us to do object-oriented programming in JavaScript. So be careful with this find and replace if you're working in larger files that may have classes in them or may have React components that are structured as classes. But this works in this file to go from class to class name. We can now put our question in the right spot. We can go ahead and put our correct answer on the page. And let's put the first incorrect answer in here, the second one in here, and the third one in here. And we're going to come back and fix this so that this shuffles. But I want to talk about a few concepts before we do that. So let's save this, make sure that our CSS is being applied. Nice. We have our question and we have our answers. You'll also notice that we've got something funky going on here. We have these HTML entities that are coming from the text that we've been given for our question. Like here's the entity for an ampersand. This is a double quotation mark, another double quotation mark. So what we need to do is figure out a way to insert those into the page in a way that renders properly, because we didn't have that problem before when we were injecting our content into the page. So when we did this in our HTML, CSS, JavaScript version of the project, we changed the inner HTML of an element and pasted in the contents of our question there, which allowed the browser to parse those entities, those HTML entities, into the appropriate characters. We can do that inside of our project here, but we can also grab a module that will just parse and translate this question into the appropriate characters for us. And that's going to be my preferred solution versus there's another way to do it where we do this, where we dangerously set inner HTML and pass in a prop for the HTML. So this is the other way that you can set the inner HTML of an element. So here, instead of putting the question inside of the paragraph, I'm going to put it into this dangerously set inner HTML and run, and we can see that those things render because they are now inserted into the inserted as HTML as opposed to inserted as text. The reason why this says dangerously set inner HTML is because it is dangerous to take some code that you've gotten from somewhere else and inject it onto your page. That code could have JavaScript injected into it, and then when you throw that onto your page, that like script tag will execute, and whatever kind of malicious code was in there could end up running. So I'm going to try and avoid using this and grab an off-the-shelf library that will handle the parsing for us without us having to set the inner HTML. So that library that we're going to grab is called he, or HE, and it's short for HTML entities, so we will install it. And again, with all of them, we want to just look through to see how to use it. So we're getting some installation instructions, and then if we look down here, the library provides an encode function, which allows you to take some HTML entities that are in their character form and turn them into the escaped form. And there is also a, scroll down a little bit, decode function that allows us to take a string that has those entities and turn them into those characters. So this is what we're going to want to run, is HTML he.decode. So flipping back, what we want to do is kill this and install that package, npm install he. And while that's installing, I'm going to start writing the code. Import he from he. And we want to do decode for our question and make sure that this is wrapped in curly brackets so that this is interpreted as JavaScript. Start up our project compiling again. Give it a second to pop open in the browser. And I'm going to kill this tab and use the tab we had already and just refresh the page. And you can see that now that question is being inserted. Those characters are being inserted properly using that he library. So when we go to inject our answers, we're also going to want to decode them because some of the trivia items can have those characters in them. Let's see if we have got any in here. I don't see any examples in here, but the Trivia API does give us answers that can have HTML entities in them. So we want to make sure that when we go ahead and shuffle our answers and display them properly that we do this decoding as well. I'm going to refactor this slightly. I'm going to do what we did in our JavaScript version of this before React, where we were creating a variable for all our answers, and we were taking the correct answer and putting it in that array, and we were spreading all of the incorrect answers into that array. So now we have an array of 4 things, and I can go ahead and replace this code. That can be all answers 0, all answers 1, all answers 2, all answers 3, and save it. Should still render the same. Whoops, nothing has changed here about our markup. We've just changed the structure slightly. And before we go any further, we need to think about how to render an array in our JSX. Because right now, the way we're structuring things is really inflexible. This will only work if all answers has 4 elements in it. But what if we had a true-false question in our data, and we wanted it to just look like this in terms of the markup? Or we had a question that had a whole bunch of other answers, other incorrect answers in it. We would need to modify the markup to account for each of those. So what we want to do instead is be able to loop over all answers and turn them into markup. And when we use a looping structure to create that markup, then we don't have to type the list item for each answer. We're no longer tied to having a specific number of answers here. Our code will be much more flexible. So what I think we're going to do is create a new component that will just be for demo purposes. We're not really going to use it in the final application, but it'll help us learn how to render arrays. So I'm going to call it, let's call it array render demo. Create a component in here, array render demo. And let's go ahead and load it into our quiz game above our stats here. And making sure that I'm importing it. Okay, so it's showing up on the page. We're going to learn how to render an array using that component. But I also want to point out that if you go to the React docs, and in the sidebar, you go to main concepts, lists, and keys. This page goes through the concepts that we're going to talk about and goes through them in depth. So it talks about how you can take an array like this numbers and end up turning it into a series of list items on the page. So I recommend reading this. Let's flip back to our code though and start working through our application. So let's say what we want to do here is we want some page within our application that has all of the categories that are within our sort of realm of quiz questions that we have. And I think we did this on our new game form somewhere in here. Yeah, we said we had general knowledge, entertainment, books, science. So I'm just going to put some of those in an array here. So I'm going to say we've got science, entertainment, books. I don't know. We can make up some. We can say art. We can say entertainment, film, etc. We could kind of fill this out with a bunch of other elements. And what we want to do is take this array, however many things are in it, and display those to the page. So we kind of want this to be, so I'm going to change this from a div to an unordered list by hitting F2 on that div, UL, and hit enter, and that renames the start and close tag. So I want to create a list here, and each list item, I want to grab one of those things. So here I want science, and then entertainment, books, entertainment, books, art, etc. We want all of the things that are in this array to show up on the page. So if I save it, we want the markup to look something like this, where we have our list with list items with all of that content inserted in. So to sort of work our way up to that, what I want to do is demonstrate a couple of concepts. So one concept that's important to this is that React knows how to render a list, specifically of JSX. So if I create like categories markup as an array, I can take each of these list items and put it in here and add a comma after each one. And then I can take this markup and drop it into my UL here. And React knows how to handle that. It knows to take each list item from this array and put it here on the page. So if I save it and run it, we can see those still showing up on the page. We've got this error that we're going to talk about in a second where it's telling us we need a key, a unique key on each element within a list. So we're not using our categories array just yet, but we could fill that in here. So we could say category 0 in our li1, categories 1 in our second li, categories 2, and why not? Let's get the last one in there. Okay, so all of those categories are showing up. This is still not what we want to do yet, because this is very inflexible. We're still indexing into our array to create each li, but the key here is that React knows how to render a list of JSX. So if we were to dynamically build up this array and fill it with each of these items by sort of looping over our categories and generating this list item for each element in the array, that would be valid. React would know what to do with that. So let's, before we do that, let's fix this key warning. So the key warning is telling us that each of these list items needs to have a property on it that is unique. So like this, if I pass in a key of 1 here, that would mean that all other list items in here would need a different key, like key 2, key 3, key 4. And the reason why these keys matter is because when React goes ahead and re-renders this component, it uses this key to figure out whether or not this is the appropriate list item to update. So the first time it renders, it gets a list of or it gets a series of these list items. They each have a unique key. When something changes and there are a new set of list items on the page, like we change the categories list up here and add a new category, React uses the key to sort of figure out how it needs to update the elements on the page. So key here, what we actually can use instead of these numbers that we're passing in is we could just use the category name. So here, instead of 1, we could pass in category 0 because our categories are all going to be unique. We're never going to have science in here twice. So I can pass in categories 1, categories 2, categories 3. And that key warning should go away. We now have a unique key on each of these elements. And now we can look at how to build up this array dynamically. So instead of what we're doing here, I can create a categories markup empty array. And I can use some of our knowledge of loops like, const category of categories, which remember, this is one of a few loop structures that we learned for being able to loop over an array. So this variable is going to be equal to science the first time the loop runs, then entertainment books, then art. And what I can do is say categories markup dot push. So this allows us to insert new items into our array, and I can put in a list item with the category, and then I can also add that key in here and pass in the category as the key. So now we've created a variable here that is dynamically filled with JSX based on whatever is in this categories array. So if I save it, check it out, it's still rendering, but the beautiful thing here, so let's close this, let's get these side by side, is that if I go ahead and remove art and save it, our component still works. Or if I add something else into here, like sports, our component is able to handle that. No matter how many categories we have in this array, our markup doesn't need to change. We've defined this general structure where we create the markup dynamically from this array. So I'll add a comment here to sort of say that we were building the JSX dynamically via a loop. So this is one way of doing it. It is a perfectly valid way of doing it, but you often see a couple of other ways in React land for doing this. So one of them is using the map function. So the map function in JavaScript is a function that exists on, it's a method of any array. So if I say categories.map, it's very similar to when we used for each. So when we said for each, and then we said something like category console.log category, this printed out each of those categories. So we essentially have this arrow function here that's defined that is saying go through, pull out the category, print it out to the console log or to the console. And we can see all of those printing out in sequence. So the map function is going to be really similar. We're still going to have this arrow function as a parameter to the map, but the difference is that a map function allows you to transform this array that we started with, categories, into a new array. So I'm going to use a longer syntax here for this array function. So it's just, we've defined, here's the input parameter category. There's also for map the index and the full array. You can get those as parameters. So like if I wanted the index for something, I would just create a second parameter here. So this function, what we need to return from it is some transformation of category. So we're going to take our input element and turn it into something else. So like a simple one might be category to uppercase. And let's take a look at that array. So what that gave us back was our element turned to uppercase. So the map function allows you to express some kind of transform on your initial array to turn it into a new array that has the same length with whatever transform applied. So whatever we put in here after the return is what is getting inserted into our upper categories array. So the first time through, it grabs science in this category variable, and when we say return science to uppercase, that puts all uppercase science into our upper categories array. So I can comment this out, and I'm just going to add a note at the top. Map allows us to transform one array to another. So we can use that same concept to do a map here where we transform the category into JSX. So I can say my categories markup is equal to categories.map category and return this JSX here and comment out this code so that we don't have competing variables with the same variable name. So save it and check it out in the browser. We should see all of those categories still printing out. And we can actually make this line of code even shorter. So when you have an arrow function, if you don't use the curly brackets and you don't use the return statement, what you have is called an implicit return. So this code, whoops, got an extra bit here. So this code on this line is equivalent to what we wrote here. When you leave off the curly brackets around your function body, you're only allowed to have one line of code in there, and it's considered, it is what gets returned. So here we are still returning a list item for each category. So just to prove that that works, comment out what we had before, show you it running. So it's still working. And then one more thing that you will often see is that rather than store this in another variable, folks will often just inject this expression directly into your markup. So code is still working, same deal. It's just that we're no longer making a variable here for that array. We are doing that inline. I don't care which syntax you use in this class, they all do the same thing functionally. I tend to prefer this kind of inline syntax when it's a small chunk of code, and then we'll occasionally break things out into separate variables when this becomes unwieldy. One thing to note though is that this, when we saved it, added extra parentheses around our JSX. And that's the same thing that was happening here. So our formatter is making sure that everything that we defined in our JSX, even though it's split over multiple lines of code, is still captured in that return. So you'll see that if you have your formatter turned on, it's useful to know why that's being inserted there. Okay, we now know enough about rendering arrays that we can come back to our quiz game. We can get rid of that rendering of arrays, and we can get rid of that import, and we can go back to our trivia item, and we can focus on, now that we have this array, let's turn it into a map that creates this list item by looping over that array. So I am going to get rid of our comment here. I am going to open and close curly brackets so that I can insert a JavaScript expression into this markup. I'll say all answers dot map, and I'm going to call my parameter here answer. and I want to have this function return this markup. So you can see I inserted the opening and close parenthesis here so that I could put this markup on multiple lines. So when I get my answer, I want to insert that here into the button, and then I can get rid of these 4 explicit lines where we were creating the list items. Save it, check it out in the browser. And we can see all of those answers loading still. And we're now getting that warning again that each list item should have a unique key prop. So what we want to do here is think about what could be unique for us to use. And our answers should conceptually be unique. It wouldn't make sense if we had laboratory retriever multiple times, if that's the right answer or the wrong answer. I think that's the right answer for this one. It wouldn't make sense to have your right answer duplicated or your wrong answer duplicated. So we can assume that our answer is unique, and we can use that as our key here. Go ahead and save it. Check it out. Our warning is gone. And now that we have refactored this to use a map function and be built off of our array, if I modified this is just for test purposes, but like let's say other distracting answer. I just throw that into our array. Our code can now handle that. So however many incorrect answers we have, they will still show up. All of them will be rendered fine. So we've made our code a lot more flexible, and we've also made it easier to maintain. So if I wanted to install a click listener to all of these buttons, I just have to modify right here. That's the only place I have to do it. I don't have to modify it for 4 separate elements, which is what we had before. So if I wanted to create an on answer click function here, let's have it take in the event. And just for the purposes of seeing something, let's say we'll have console.log, and we can say you chose event.target.inner HTML. Down here with our button, we can say on click and pass in that function. Save it, and now when I click on any of these, we should see that inner HTML printing out when I click on them. And we can actually tell whether they chose the right answer or the wrong answer. So let's pull this out into a variable. Let's say the player answer is equal to this inner HTML. So we can still say you chose player answer. If player answer equals correct answer, which we have as a property up here, just print out correct. Otherwise, wrong. So if I save it, click on lab, I get correct. Any of the other ones, I get wrong printing out. So we're getting there. As I'm looking at this, I'm remembering that we forgot to do this decode for our answers. So I'm just going to make sure that I throw that in here, just in case any of the answers that we get happen to have HTML entities in it. Now our code should work. So now comes a tricky aspect of building this out. So part of React is that you typically, let's see if I've got the whiteboard still up. The way that you usually want state to flow is from higher level components down to lower level components. So parents pass their state down to child elements, like our quiz game passed the score down to the stats and passed the trivia index down to TriviaItem. So it's usually a top-down flow. And when multiple components need access to a state, usually move that state up higher in your hierarchy so that you can pass it down to the components that need it. So how do we do this, notifying when right, wrong is selected from the TriviaItem? We're not going to pass state from TriviaItem to QuizGame, but what we can do is have QuizGame pass down a function to TriviaItem, and TriviaItem can call that function, which will effectively run some code inside of QuizGame. So that's conceptually what we're going to do. As we start coding it, it'll make more sense. So inside of QuizGame, let's just have a on answer selected function here. And we can say something like the QuizGame now knows that an answer was selected. And with TriviaItem, we can define a new property here and pass in this function. So I can call this whatever I want. I just need to make sure that it matches in the usage of TriviaItem here and the definition of TriviaItem back in our TriviaItem.js file. So let's call this on, we'll just, for the sake of consistency, call it the same thing as our function, on answer selected. And we're going to pass in this function. So now back inside of TriviaItem, I have a new prop that I have access to, on answer selected. And this is a function. So anytime inside of TriviaItem I call this, that means that this function inside of QuizGame is going to run, which has access to the score and the trivia index. So just to see that running, like I'm just going to throw it in here and invoke it. Whoops, got a typo. Invoke that right when the TriviaItem renders. So we should see that print out immediately. QuizGame now knows an answer was selected. That's not the right place to put it, but that's the idea, is that inside of TriviaItem, we can actually get some code to run inside of QuizGame. So this is that notification. So we want to do this in here. So we're able to get the player's answer, and then we can go ahead and tell QuizGame, the answer's been selected. Go do your thing. So now when I run it and I click on Golden Retriever, we still get the right, wrong, and then we get that code inside of QuizGame that's running. So our code inside of QuizGame can set the trivia index to be trivia index +1. So that will move us one question further into our array. So if I refresh it and I click on one, we're now at the next question in our array. Click another, next question in our array. Keep going, and at a certain point, this is going to error out because we have gone past the number of items that we had in our array. So we'll have to fix that eventually and make sure that we get like an end screen that displays. But that's conceptually the idea, is we can notify our QuizGame when something happens on the child element by simply just passing a function in as a prop. Now this isn't all of the information that QuizGame needs, right? Because when we pick an answer, we know that we need to go to the next question, but we also need QuizGame to know whether that thing that was picked was right or wrong, so that if it's right, we can go ahead and increment the score. So what we can do here is define another parameter. So we could say, was player correct? And when we go ahead and invoke this method, this function, inside of TriviaItem, we will pass in true or false based on whether or not the player was correct. So I'm going to print this out so that we can see it. Was player correct? Go back to TriviaItem. So when we now call this onTriviaSelected function, we need to pass in true if it was correct, or false if it was wrong. So on answer selected, true, false. And we can get rid of this correct, wrong printing out. Flip back. So if I click on Golden Retriever, we see you chose Golden Retriever, Quiz Game knows an answer was selected, and Quiz Game knows that it was the wrong answer that was selected. And keep going, and I should really know the answer to some of these. I have not seen this one, but I'm pretty sure Clint Eastwood is not in it. Good. Okay, so we can see that it also works when we get the right answer. It's printing out was player correct true. So we can shorten this. We don't have to have an if statement here. What instead we can do is on answer selected, pass in this comparison. So this will turn into a true or false value. And if we wanted to, we could, break this out into multiple lines. Like we could say, was player correct is equal to this, and then use this variable and pass that in. Should function the same way. So if I click on lab, we should hopefully see true. Yep, we see true. If I get this wrong, we should see false. Which means we've effectively passed this information on. I'm going to get rid of this console.log. We don't need it anymore. We've passed this information on from the child up to the parent, this quiz game. So now the parent element can say if the player was correct, we can go ahead and set the score to be score +1. So we're going to move the trivia up 1, and we're also going to increment the score, but only if the player was correct. So we can save it, run it again, and see, click on lab, score goes up by 1, get it wrong, score doesn't go up. So this is the heart of the logic that we've just mapped out. We have our state in our quiz game, that gets passed down to our stats and our trivia item, and our trivia item is able to sort of communicate the result of that trivia item back up to the quiz game through a property. We can just pass in a function to our trivia item, which can call that function and notify quiz game whether or not the player was correct. So we've still got some work to do to actually get these trivia items shuffling on the page. And we also want to make sure that the player can see these marked as correct or incorrect when we click on them, and get some animation in here like we did in the HTML version. But since this video is already getting a little long, we're going to stop it here. We got the core of the logic, and we'll save that polishing for next time. And some of the other things we'll sort of add in as we improve it and polish it. We'll learn how to store some information, like the high score, into the local state. So that will be when you refresh the page and you revisit it in the future, you'll have some information that you can store in the React application to reference later. And we'll also look at how to actually fetch some of this information dynamically from the API, rather than have us have a trivia items JavaScript file here that has a sequence that we've pulled, sort of hand curated. We'd be able in the future to have it just when the app loads, go talk to the API and grab 50 random questions from the entertainment category. Okay, so that's it for this video. Take some time, look through this code, play with this code, because this idea of data flowing from parent components down to child components, and child components notifying parent components via functions that you pass in parameters is a common concept in React, and you will likely be using it in your final project.